Irena Sender was born on February 15th, 1910 in Warsaw, Poland. She was raised in the Catholic faith and was named after Saint Irene of Rome. Her naming day was October 20th. Her mother, Janina, would be in her life for many years, yet her father, Stanslaw, was not. He was a medical doctor and a humanitarian. He made an effort to treat Jewish people and sometimes treat them without charge. This led him to work within the Jewish community in Otwock, a town 15 miles southeast of Warsaw. Stanslaw felt that he had a moral duty to serve those who were poor and outcast. But in the Typhus outbreak of 1917, the 43-year-old doctor contracted the disease from the very people he treated. Stanslaw died from typhus when Irena was only 7 years old, but the mark he left on his young daughter would turn out to be legendary. But now, as a 33-year-old in the very midst of the Warsaw ghetto, Irena didn't know that, nor did she fully understand what the cost of saving Jewish children from the ghetto might be. As she stood in the candle-lit house, impatiently waiting for the parents to say goodbye to their newborn daughter, all Irena could think about was her father and all that he taught her by his words and his actions. In the circumstances she had now placed herself in, Irena wondered if she would soon join him. Time would tell. The minutes had run out. Irena nearly had to pry the fragile baby from her mother's grip. There was just no more time to say goodbye. And even though Irena repeatedly assured the child would be reunited with the parents after the war, it never got easy for her to talk mothers out of their children, much less promise the impossible. While she tried to give as much hope as she could muster under the circumstances, Irena believed most parents knew they'd never see their child again. Yet, they were trusting this young Polish social worker to save their child's life from the near certain death of the Warsaw ghetto. Irena quickly placed 3 drops of luminol in the baby's mouth. As the child immediately began to fade in Irena's left arm, she opened the toolbox on the ground with her right, placing a relatively clean cloth on the bottom and along the sides. The child was already unconscious in the short time that Irena took to prepare the makeshift cradle. While all babies at the time were malnourished and weak, Irena always tried to find the right balance between under and over sedation. This time, Irena thought she might have given too much. The especially delicate state of the baby caused her to second guess, but again, there was no time for that. The truck outside revved its engine as a sign to hurry up. Unknown to Irena, 2 SS guards turned onto the street outside, only 50 yards from the house. Once the child was laid inside the perforated toolbox and covered with clean pieces of cloth, Irena put on a pair of thin rubber gloves and placed layers of blood-soiled dressings and bandages on top of the baby. She tried to shield the parents from seeing this part of the transfer by using her body to cover the stealth movements of her hands. Mechanically, Irena closed the lid to the box, sealing the sleeping infant inside. She stood up with the toolbox in hand, gave a solemn nod to the grieving parents, stepped outside, and closed the door. As she descended the 5 stairs to the waiting truck on the street, Irena could see the SS guards walking towards her from the corner of her eye. As quickly as she could move without raising suspicion, Irena opened the tailgate to the morgue wagon and forcibly shoved the toolbox in between the cold legs of a corpse on the bottom of the large pile of bodies. Such was the amount of dead stacked in the back of the truck that Irena struggled to close the tailgate. Her heart was beating so loud in her ears that she didn't notice the footsteps approaching behind her. Just when she managed to close the gate, a hand grabbed her shoulder and spun her around. Irena gasped. These were not Jewish police, nor the Polish Blue Police, nor were they just German officers. These were SS guards, and they were unpredictable, their brutality being unrivaled. Before Irena could say anything, the soldier barked orders. Trying to control her shaking hands, Irena showed her papers, Department of Social Welfare and Public Health of the city of Warsaw. While one guard started to scrutinize Irena's papers, his partner opened the tailgate, only to recoil, not at the sight of the cold pile of lifeless bodies, but being too close to them. Irena was in utter shock. She always feared being caught, but never imagined that it would look like this. The guard pointed to the toolbox with his rifle and asked Irena what was inside. Irena didn't speak German, but she clearly knew what he wanted. Typhus was the only word that she knew the guard would understand. Soiled typhus rags, she repeated. The two guards could see Irena was a nurse from her uniform, so it wasn't out of place for her to be working with the sick and the dying. Yet, they seemed unconvinced. The guard handed Irena her identification papers back and motioned for her to open the toolbox. Her heart utterly sank, and she felt her throat began to seize up. But the guards could not discern her panic. Irena had always been bold and courageous, and in this time when it took all her strength just to keep her composure, she gambled that a feigned fearlessness would work towards her advantage. Everything depended on this. Not only this baby's life and her own life, but the lives of thousands of children that Irena and so many others had helped escape the inevitable death of the ghetto. In an instant, as Irena stepped toward the toolbox, it was almost as if her life flashed before her eyes. The raw emotion stirred by her present encounter with the Nazis induced a few particular memories that seared back into her mind in vivid, intangible detail, and all she could see was the face of Rochella. When Irena was 13 years of age, Rochella was the only Jewish girl in her class who was routinely discriminated against and taunted by classmates for a variety of reasons. One day, Irena saw Rochella being beat up in the park next to their school by two larger girls. Irena did not hesitate to help. She jumped on the girls and started to throw her fist in blind rage. The two attackers left Rochella only to pummel Irena unconscious. After this time, Irena was stereotyped by the school as being a Jew lover. She was castigated by many of her Polish friends. Yet, among the scorn and shame that Irena felt, there remained a quiet pride in her heart for knowing that what she did was ultimately right. And this caused her to continue to stand on the moral convictions instilled to her by her father, who once told his daughter, "If you see a man drowning, you must try and save him, even if you cannot swim." His death left a large hole in Irena's heart, yet she strove to live up to his example of caring for the outcast. And so, as the years passed, Irena continued to find herself at odds with the spirit of the time. In her last year of high school, Irena wrote a paper entitled Repairing Poland, in which she argued that Poland's economic and political chaos was wrongly placed on minority groups, especially the Jews. It was not received well, and it served as a precursor to her time in college. In the early 1930s, Irena was a student in the University of Warsaw, and by this time the political landscape had only gotten worse, and the anti-Semitic doctrines and propaganda increased as Hitler's rhetoric had begun to take root in Poland. Jews were singled out first for intellectual assault, cloaked in academic finesse and scientific reason, but before long that facade was abandoned in favor of fist and batons. Irena witnessed this. The other memory that intruded upon Irena's mind was one she hadn't thought about for years, as she tried hard to keep it buried because of its brutality. A young Jewish woman was thrown out of a 2-story building at the university. The woman didn't die, but the school basically did nothing against the violent attack. One feeble way the university sought to control the growing violence on campus was through segregation. In lecture halls, certain benches were only for the Jews, also known as ghetto benches, while the rest were for Aryans. One day, Irena was overcome by the university's treatment of minorities that, as she entered the lecture hall, she sat down in the front row of the Jewish bench. Everyone's eyes were on her in disbelief. When asked for a response by the professor, Irena adamantly replied to everyone, "Today, I am a Jew." She was immediately suspended from school. When she was explaining this to her mother as to why she did it, Irena simply said, "I had to do it. It was a need of my heart." Once Irena's hand touched the toolbox with the sedated infant inside, her recollection snapped back to the present reality. Amongst the fear, Irena had always been courageous, and now all the events in her life seemed to culminate in this very real moment, where if the baby was found, she would be taken as a prisoner, interrogated, tortured, and most likely murdered. Everything hinged on this act of boldness. So, acting as if she was more perturbed than scared, Irena opened the 2 latches of the box and boldly swung open the lid. She thrust her hand into the toolbox and grabbed a handful of the rank rags and bandages. She held them out. The motionless body of the infant was clearly revealed, but out of sight from the guards, who stood only 5 feet away. All it took was for one of them to take a step closer to see the newborn sleeping in the box. Not surprisingly for SS guards, they seemed more disgusted at the sight of soiled rags than the truck full of corpses. With a look of repulsion and a hand signal of dismissal, they took a step back and commanded Irena to leave. Still in character, Irena threw the rags back into the box and shut the tailgate. She jumped into the passenger seat of the truck and looked at the driver, one of the few Poles who was rewarded for doing these good deeds for a few hundred zloty. Tears welled up in Irena's eyes as her heart released all the stirring emotions that had been suppressed, not only in the last few minutes, but in the last few years. Words fail to describe what one feels like when great fear and great joy collide, not to mention when simultaneous exhaustion and adrenaline are thrown into the mix. Irena's burden of fears and pains was great, but it was ultimately outweighed by the joyous relief of not being caught. After the child was dropped off with her false identity documents at the caretaker's house and the truck driver was paid for the delivery, Irena walked home slowly, thankful to be alive but reminiscing about better times. Before the Nazi invasion, Irena would have been coming home to a joyful celebration with friends and family, as October 20th was her naming day. And although Irena was born on February 15th, her naming day was celebrated on October 20th, the saint's day for whom Irena was named after. She was 33 years old. Much like a birthday, naming days were usually special and happy times. But after 5 years of Nazi occupation, there was very little happiness to be had by anyone. Irena went to bed that night saddened at everything the Nazis had taken, but grateful she herself had not been taken by them. Irena fell asleep quickly. She slept a bit more peaceful that night than normal. That was until the violent pounding on the door. So we'll continue that story next week, but I wanted to highlight something from Irena's life in the short account that we listened to right now. Again, as a recap, Irena was born in 1910 in Warsaw, Poland, and she really became a World War II hero. I just learned of her 6 months ago, and I'm hoping that more people will know more of who she is, and that she would become more well known. She was a social worker at the time when the Nazis occupied Poland. And because of her job and what she did, she was able to enter the Jewish ghetto, and she would smuggle kids out. She would forge documents. She would give new identities. She would bribe or try to bribe soldiers, and anything that she could do to save children, she did. She ended up being arrested by the Gestapo, and we'll learn more about that next week. But by the end of, after it was all said and done, her and her associates and her the people that she worked with, she was responsible for nearly rescuing 2,500 children out of the ghetto. But I want to highlight a few things, because before she found herself in the midst of, Nazi controlled ghettos, smuggling children out before they were either starved to death or put on trains to concentration camps. Before all of that, Irena was already putting herself into a position to defend Jewish children and Jewish people altogether. She didn't wake up one morning and just decide to be a World War II hero. In fact, she never tried to be a hero, and she even denounced kind of being called and considered a hero, because she lived with, regrets in her life. She wished she could have done more. And in the story that we looked at today, we see her in three kind of different situations. In 1917, she would have been 7 years old, and her father told her, if you see a man drowning, you must save him, even if you don't know how to swim. He instilled into his daughter this mindset of doing what is right at all cost. At all costs, do what you know what is right. And not only did her father just tell her these words, but he really lived that out. He gave her an example of what it looks like to save someone, even if it cost your own life. And we see Irena in these three different circumstances risking her own well-being to save someone else. So at the age of 13, would have been in the mid-1920s, we see her in grade school, in maybe junior high, and a Jewish girl in her class was getting beat up by these two other students, and Irena entered into that and really received the beating that this Jewish girl was taking. But she entered into the situation at her own risk. And then later on in high school, she was writing papers and writing arguments against racism, because it just was the spirit of the time. She wrote against that, and she was, they took measures to sort of discipline her because of the paper she was writing. And we have to remember that Hitler didn't assume power until 1933, and he didn't invade Poland until 1939, almost 1940. So she was doing all these things before Nazis were actually entering in. In the mid 1930s, we see Irena and we see her just in shock because of the way that Jewish people were being treated. And so she entered into her school one day and she sat down on the Jewish bench, and she said, "Today I am a Jew." Irena became all things to all people. Before Germany invaded Poland and there was this anti-Semitic spirit of the age, Irena became a Jew. She embodied this truth from Scripture that in order to save people literally and figuratively, we are called to become like them. We're called to meet them where they are. And Irena did that. If you think about it in the literal sense, you can't save a drowning person by simply yelling directions at them from the land. You have to go into the water, and you have to risk your own well-being in order to pull that person out to safety. But in a spiritual sense, it's much the same. And Paul addresses this principle in 1 Corinthians 9:22. He says, "To the weak I became weak in order to win the weak." He says, "I have become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some." And he says the reasons why he does this: "I do this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings." Paul, he gave up his freedoms for the benefit of drawing people closer to the Lord. He became weak to those who were weak. He became like a Jew who was under the law to the Jews who were under the law. He became a Gentile in order to win Gentiles to Christ. He became all things to all people. And we see this also in the example of Jesus. He is the greatest example that we have. And we see him in his life. He could speak with academics. Even at the age of 12, he was with these learned, religious, and righteous men, dialoguing with them. Okay? And he was actually a teacher because he was a rabbi. So he was learned. He didn't go to school, but he was learned in the scriptures, and he could dialogue with those people. And yet at the same time, who did he often associate with? Poor fishermen. Also rich tax collectors. He was with Jews and he was with Gentiles, and he was with everybody in between that. He associated with both the righteous and the unrighteous. He became all things to all people. And even more than just those instances in Jesus' life, he had to become a man, and this is a mystery, but he had to become a man in the fullness of times. Galatians 4:4 says he had to become a man in order to save man. And look at these words in Philippians that Paul writes. He says, "Have this attitude in yourself, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, he did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped or something to hold on to, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant and being made in the likeness of men. Being found in an appearance of a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross." So this is a great mystery, no doubt. But Paul's saying that Jesus, he emptied himself. He emptied himself and took on the form of a bondservant. He became a man. And not only just did he become a man, but he humbled himself and he became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. So not only did Jesus somehow empty himself to become a man, and not only did he become all things to all sorts of different types of people, but further than that, he became the sacrifice through which we are all forgiven. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21 is one of my favorite verses, and it paints this picture perfectly. It says, "For he made him," that's God the Father made Jesus, "for he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him." Paul became a Gentile to save Gentiles. Irena became a Jew to save Jews. And Jesus became a man to save man. And he became the sacrifice to redeem us all. And the question that I think we need to ask ourselves as believers is, what does love become like in our lives now? We are living in very precarious times. We have a bit of political chaos going on. We have racial tensions. We have false media narratives. We have economic strain, to say it the least. And this isn't even to mention the pandemic of COVID-19. We are living in not only precarious times, but unprecedented times. And we don't know how things are going to turn out, whether for the better or for the worse. Just like Irena didn't know how things were going to turn out, either do we. But what matters is that we are doing what we know is right. And sometimes when we do that, it will be to our own harm. Who is the Jew that you can become? Who is the Gentile? Who is the weak? Who is the afflicted? When we become all things to all people, we actually become more like Jesus, right? God is love, and love became a man. And it's God's clear desire that in turn, we become love to others. Irena Sender gave us a very real and raw example of what this might look like. And my question to you is that we would have the humility and the courage to be used in the same manner that Irena Sender was used. And may God grant us wisdom and clarity as we ask this question of ourselves. And before saying goodbye, I just wanted to admit the very obvious about this podcast. All this my podcast is my subpar writing, coupled with my fairly unclear and slurred words. And all of this is on top of music in the background. And the music is really makes these podcast episodes something enjoyable. Or at least, if it wasn't for the music, they would just be horrible. The music is great. And this music, all the music you heard on this on this episode, Irena, was done by my friend and master musician. His name is Joel. And please, if you have any needs, music needs, if your church has a need, if you are in advertising or movie making, or you know someone who has a need for great original music, please check out my friend Joel. His website is joelkk.com. And I would just, hope you can check him out, listen to his music. And he's not only a great musician, but he's a great friend and a great man. So proud to call him my friend and very excited that he did the music for this episode. Again, thanks for listening. I hope you found this podcast to be engaging, encouraging, and enlightening. Please, as always, if you leave a review and rate this, it always puts the podcast out to more people, and it's a real blessing if you do that. If you know of someone who would benefit from this episode or podcast, please tell them about it, share it with them. Visit our website, salvationstuff.simplecast.com, or you can go to just salvationstuff.com. Thanks again. I love you and appreciate you all, and we'll see you next time. Bye.